Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth in the series of 4 recent webinars exploring new developments and emerging issues in the world of continuing education in Canada. The title of today's webinar is The Recognition of Alternative Digital Credentials. My name is David Manzik. I'm the Acting Dean of the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba, and I've been asked to act as a moderator for today's highly anticipated session. We're glad you're with us. Since we only have an hour, let's get right down to business and meet today's panelist. First, we have Julia Denholm, who's the Dean of Lifelong Learning at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Julie has extensive experience in teaching and leadership in higher education. Before joining SFU, she was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Dean of Kalahai, the Sunshine Coast campus at Capilano University. She previously held roles at Langara College and UBC. Julia has a PhD in Educational Studies, as well as a BA Honors and an MA in English Literature, all from UBC. Julia joins us from SFU's Vancouver campus, and as such, she respectfully acknowledges the unceded traditional territories, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations on which SFU Vancouver is located. Next, we have Dan Piedra, Assistant Director of Continuing Education at McMaster University in Hamilton. Dan oversees online course design and development, including all certificate and diploma programs. Previously, he served in similar positions at Sheridan College and as Director of Conestoga College's Continuing Education Department. He's also served as an instructor of online and in-person programs at several other institutions, including Brock University. Dan completed both his BEd and MSc at Brigham Young University and is currently working on his PhD in education at Brock. His research interests lie in such areas as exploring the quality of online learning in areas of instructor training, instructional design, the humanization of online courses, the use of non-traditional assessments, and alternative digital credentials. And as I said, Dan joins us from McMaster in Hamilton, and as such, he recognizes and acknowledges that his university is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And finally, we have Rod Lastra, Associate Dean Academic and Acting Associate Area Director of the Access Program in the Division of Extended Ed at the U of M. Rod earned his BSc, MSc, and PhD, all from the University of Manitoba. He's been with the division since 2013 and joined the Dean's office in 2017. We've asked Rod to return this week after helping us to decipher the meaning of microcredentials in last week's webinar. We thought that for the benefit of all, whether you were able to join us or not, it would be good to have a very brief recap of what we discussed at last week's webinar. So today's webinar will be more of a natural extension of what we discussed last week, and will be sort of next steps, implications for practice, so what kind of question. Rod and I join you from the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and as such, we acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, just a few words about how today's session has been organized. As I said, Rod will provide a brief overview of what he covered last week. And for those of you who were able to join us at the time, you'll remember that it was quite a substantial presentation, lots of detail, a lot of depth, and we thought a recap would certainly help. Then instead of formal presentations, today's session will be more of a conversation between Julia, Dan, and Rod in response to 5 overarching questions that Rod will ask. Since today's session will run only an hour in length, we will end the first part of the session in about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave the last 10 or so minutes for a Q&A at the end. So please write your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at that time. And just before I hand things over to the people you really want to hear from today, please be advised that, as with the other webinars, we are recording today's session so that you can go back and watch it again at your own leisure. Now, without any further ado, let's hand things over to Rod, Julia, and Dan. Rod.
Thanks, David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you. So thanks, everyone. As David mentioned, we are going to be doing a bit of a recap in terms of what I talked about last week of micro credentials, with the idea that what I want to do is to perhaps position the discussion and argument I had last week as a segue into this discussion today, which is going to be looking at the recognition of alternative credentials. So really what we're going to be trying to today is unpacking the specific terms and concepts that are related to the recognition of alternative credentials. So before we do that, let's kind of talk a little bit about what was discussed last week. And as David mentioned, it was a fairly lofty presentation in the sense that both myself and Jessica spoke in some detail in terms of the opportunities, the challenges, the functional definitions of what we mean by micro-credentials, and also kind of the application of this, at least within the Athabasca framework. Now, in terms of the major findings that were done based on some analysis of the literature and analysis of programming data, one of the major ideas that came out of this was the fact that when we talk about micro, credentials, the notion seems to kind of, the perceptions seem to kind of be focused on the idea of micro and credential. Micro being the fact that most of us at least understand that these offerings are short in duration. Micro being that we also understand that the outcomes that we're trying to achieve are based on discrete skills and competencies versus the more comprehensive envelope of things that are being done in other types of credentials. Now, when it comes to the credentialing part, that's where it gets a little blurry, right? So either these things can be authentic institutional credentials in the form of certificates. They can be in the form of non-credentialed learning, as in badges or other forms of things that we can actually recognize. But there is a bit of a gray area with respect to the credentialing part of micro-credentials, right? But one of the things that we do know, though, is that we are forming a little bit of a consensus. So on the right-hand side of the slide there, you see a kind of clustering of a meta-analysis that was done based on the literature. And basically what we have is either consensus, semi-consensus, and confusion on terms that we've all kind of agreed on. And the consensus is kind of the important point that I like to focus on, is the fact that one of the things that we all seem to agree on at a national level and perhaps international level is the fact that micro-credentials are really a digital recognition of learning outcomes. That's really, really, really important. And as I will be repeating, and we will be repeating in this presentation, that is really the game changer, I suppose. The other one is that these things are informed by industry and learners, right? They are multimodal in terms of offers. They are discrete. Formal learning in most cases is being done. There's a quality assurance framework that needs to be kept in mind. Transferability, in other words, the currency of what we're doing here, is ultimately important, hence the conversations about coming up with a national framework. The lack of a national framework or lack of a national consensus means that we might be undermining the very intent of these programs in terms of their portability. The other one is that we also recognize that these things can be standalone, modular learning, or they can be stackable. In terms of semi-consensus, program duration is where we have some consensus. We know these things are short. How short is short? Well, we don't really know that, apart from the fact that some provincial jurisdictions seem to define that for us. We also know that these are competency-based education models, and that's a lot to unpack. I'm not going to get into that right now, but you can look at the video last week. I'll talk a little bit about that. They are a secure platform. Again, a lot there to talk about. Blockchaining is one of them. Transcripts are another, right? Embedding into existing credentials is where there is semi-consensus, and prior learning and assessment, again, recognition that could be important. Where there is a whole line of confusion is how do we implement badges? What are badges? Are badges micro-credentials? That's what we don't know. And the degree pathways is something else that's also kind of confusing as well. In terms of micro-credentials, where we talk about a variation on an old idea, it's simply this. When we look at the framework of knowledge, skills, and competencies, we find that the domain of knowledge, skills, and competencies for credentials, being either degree or certificate or micro-credentials, really fall on the spectrum. Degree, as we know, kind of capture perhaps all of them with a focus more on knowledge and skills. Here's the interesting part. Certificates and micro-credentials, apart from maybe scope and level of comprehension, cover the same domain. So that's important to bear in mind. One thing I did share last week was this kind of covariance analysis, which I'm fairly fond of, which was looking at the number of courses and number of of contact hours within programs and in courses. This includes modular offers of learning outcomes. And when we look at both undergraduate programs in science, for example, classic certificate programs being offered across the country, and any micro-credential, one of the things we do find is that the level of expectation where these things fall are within prediction. Those envelopes that you see in the diagram are 95% confidence intervals of random expectation. Anything that falls within those envelopes is what we expect to find. Anything that's outside is kind of random expectation. Watch this. So one of the things I talked briefly last week is that when it comes to undergraduate programs, specifically ones in science, we have a high degree of agreement. In other words, no surprise that because of a qualification frameworks based on a degree program, we find a fair bit of expectation, predictability in terms of programs that you take across the country. When it comes to certificate programs, by and large, despite the fact that there is no national definition of what a certificate is, we're doing a pretty good job. There is some variation, but here's the big take-home message. The degree of variability that exists among micro-credentials and certificate programs is more or less statistically about the same. So not only do they cover the same domain, but they seem to be equally variant. So that's important to note. So a couple of points that we talked about last week is that never in our collective history have we invested so much thought and energy into a programming idea such as this. In other words, we've never spent in the last 50 years talking about the fact that we don't have a national framework for certificates. Not to say that that wasn't on the radar, but it wasn't something that we certainly spend a lot of time on, right? The fact that we may be reaching consensus despite a divergency of action, right? And also, too, that micro-credentials may not functionally be different from alternative credentials, and we'll talk about that shortly. So what then is the big idea when we talk about micro-credentials? This is a bit of a debatable proposition, but nonetheless, here it is. If we talk about the emergent properties and perhaps the unique value propositions of micro-credentials, and again, not to say that what we do in micro-credentials is not important, but let's talk about the unique value proposition. This perhaps is it. I provided a bunch of topics and a bunch of ideas in terms of what they are, hence why this is H, but this is the one really I want to focus on. This is the innovative idea, perhaps, the democratization of learning. And Julia and Dan will talk more about this shortly, right? So this is a really important notion, perhaps, that really makes micro-credentials stand apart from what we're doing within CE, but also within traditional streams as well. So Julia and Dan are going to speak more about this. And I think in doing so, we have a number of questions that we'd like to address. I'm going to begin by actually covering the first three very briefly. I'll hand the floor over to Julie and Dan to speak about any points that I might have missed, and then we're going to go on to the last big two questions that we'll spend quite some time trying to unpack. So the first one is, basically, how do we recognize traditional credentialing within higher education? What are alternative credentials? What is the difference between a badge, a wallet, and a transcript, an e-transcript? And then we get into the whole notion of trying to unpack what we mean by the democratization of learning and the implications of that. So let's begin a little bit about that traditional aspect here. The traditional aspect is been working for many years. It really looks it's based on kind of attempting to quantify the courses that students take and complete and their grades in transcripting them into a transcript. In other words, saying, if you take a course, here's the outcome. Or if you take a course and if you drop the course, then it's going to be recognized in some kind of institutional student record. And with that, we also recognize credentials that are embedded within the whole stream. Now, the problem with this approach, and the problem that's been well identified, is that the institutions own, validate, and issue these things, and they are owned and validated and issued by individual institutions, which makes it very difficult for the learner to take multiple learning outcomes from different institutions and to show them out, outside of a stream of a CV. They're not easy to obtain and share, right? They don't document learning outcomes. And they don't document other things that are important for students in terms of their lifelong learning journey. With respect to what we mean by alternative credentials and in very simple terms, what we mean is anything outside the scope of a degree ecosystem, right? From diplomas to certificates, micro-credentials to things offered by non-institutional providers. So we're talking about the spectrum of things, right? The spectrum of things that exist outside of this degree ecosystem. So let's talk about this notion. I'm going to hand this over to Dan and Julia if they want to add a few things. When we talk about badging, open badging, which is really a form of articulating learning outcomes in this platform, one of the things that we need to recognize about how open badging is being used right now is that it is really oftentimes being implemented as assessed mechanisms of describing discrete learning outcomes. And this is a non-credential way of recognizing the attainment of those learning outcomes. So for example, University X could offer a micro credential in machine learning, and they could offer a badge to say that you will get the recognition of very discrete outcomes, for example, level 1 Python coding. And that could be articulated in something called metadata that is embedded within the badge itself. Some institutions are using this notion of badging in order to say if you get 1 or 2 or 3 of these badges and stack them together, you can get a credential, a micro credential, or a different type of credential. But this is really the way that we authentically articulate those learning outcomes. And this is where there is a little bit of confusion. Now, last but not least, when it comes to digital wallets and transcripts, here's where it gets really messy. Digitary has been the platform of choice around the globe right now that is really informing this space, right? In Canada is MyCreds is really what is picking up, which is a variant based on this engine, on this Digitary engine. And how it works is this: is that it is an innovation in recognizing learning outcomes. It does allow the learner to include information from an institution that perhaps is non-traditional. So formal learning, non-formal learning, and non-traditional learning in the form of micro-credentials and certificates. And that you can also get multiple institutions recognized within this wallet, this credential wallet. Here's the challenge. It's not necessarily owned by the learner. Here's the other challenge that many don't know. Those learning outcomes are not necessarily easily articulated. So it really begs the question then, when we talk about the big idea, what are the challenges? So I'm going to hand it over to Dan and Julia as we begin to unpack this notion of the democratization of learning. Dan and Julia?
Sure, I'll jump in on just a couple of items there with regards to your slides and your comments there, Rod. Again, thanks everybody for joining us. I'm happy to be here. I did want to just touch on 1 or 2 things here. First of all, the use of alternative digital credentials, I do believe, can provide that digitally, the digital information that is very rich. It's a very rich record of relevant skills and competencies. And in essence, alluding back to something that Rod said, I do believe can render the traditional university transcript increasingly irrelevant, perhaps even obsolete. If you think about what we currently do with the type of information that we provide in a transcript, it's very, very archaic, given the amount of, the availability of sharing information that we have today. So when you think about it from the perspective of a student, of a graduate, they really don't have a tool to share what they've learned. And the information that's provided in a transcript is very, very cursory and really does nothing to share what the individual has learned. So I think that where the alternative digital credentials take us is to a place where the information can be shared readily, digitally, and can include a lot of metadata, which is not currently available through a transcript. So the individual can provide information in terms of the training body or the academic institution that issued the training, the amount of time that was spent, specifics, the details about the work that was required to learn, and many, many other forms of detail. So I think that's an important point moving forward, because that is a great empowering force for the learner that up until now, everything resides behind a brick wall within academia. They have to pay, they have to ask permission for a transcript that in the end doesn't really tell you anything. The other item that I wanted to touch on was, in one of your slides there, Rod showed I think the ecosystem, the various types of alternative digital credentials, and they're all over the place. And there's many different names and terminologies being used. I think there's a concern for standardization. Certainly, there's talk around that we don't have a national standard. We don't have a provincial standard even in most provinces. I don't think that should necessarily deter us, though. If you think about how continuing education, for example, has operated and offered a multitude of short programs over the years. If you ask what a certificate is across the province of Ontario and even across Canada, you're going to get all sorts of different answers and variations and flavors. And yet, through all of that, we've been able to provide short-term training, skill-specific, related to work, industry needs. And it hasn't stopped the institutions from attracting students. And it hasn't stopped students from being able to navigate that confusing landscape and find what they need. So while it could be better, no doubt about it, I don't know if that's pie in the sky kind of stuff, if we're ever going to get there, but it shouldn't stop us from moving forward, because I think in the end, the learner and the public will find what they need. So I'll just stop right there, and I'll let Julie chime in.
And thanks, Rod, for the summary. I love that co-covariant slide so much, because it addresses exactly what Dan was just talking about, that the fact that we don't have a national framework, the fact that we don't have a national or even provincial definitions around these things isn't such a big issue. We tend kind of naturally to gravitate to approximations of similarity across our programming, and it's really validating, actually, to see the academic analysis. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to talk a little bit about a question that my colleagues that I work with regularly love to ask, which is, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? I'm finding at my institution, where terrifyingly I'm referred to as the resident expert on micro-credentials, that what I end up talking about is just what we've been doing institutionally for 50 years. And we're talking now nationally about this notion of a micro-credential that I don't think is any different than anything we've been doing, other than the fact that it appears to be addressing the problem that we're hearing from industry, which is that employers are not easily able to see from a traditional transcript what the learning is that their potential employees are bringing. So for these many years, employers have used an undergraduate degree as a proxy for employment readiness to some degree. And then we've seen, particularly with the increasing suspicion with which higher education is being held in the United States, this desire for validation and for taking the implicit and making it explicit. So I see micro-credentials as arising from actually suspicions around what post-secondary education is offering and providing for learners. And this employer and market-driven expectation that competencies be explicitly defined. And so what becomes really important and central and key to this whole conversation is, what then is the process by which learning is assessed and validated? And so quality assurance is really key. And when I talk about micro-credentials at my institution, I feel really strongly that we have an enormous opportunity in our field to use micro-credentials as the place where we can really validate the quality assurance processes that we bring to the development of our curriculum. And so there's actually a multitude of opportunity for us to use this conversation around micro-credentials to elevate the recognition of our curriculum. And where we're seeing that play out at Simon Fraser University is that we've created a pathway program whereby students who complete one of 6 of our non-credit continuing studies credentials can combine that learning with work experience, and by that means meet the basis of admission for our graduate diploma in business administration. So we've got a non-credit to credit pathway that takes students into graduate studies without having had to complete an undergraduate degree. And I would put out as an opportunity to anyone who's here today, take a look at what the bases of admission are for your graduate programming and see if there are programs that are admitting students on some kind of PLAR assessment that doesn't include an undergraduate degree. And that's the way that you can look at building these pathways from potentially non-credit to graduate studies or to other for-credit studies. And these are the places where I see this conversation around micro-credentialing being really valuable to us as continuing education professionals in public post-secondary in Canada.
Thanks, Julia. So a question for both you and Dan is then, when we talk about the value of micro-credentials, I mean, if we're really talking about doing things that we've done for, at least in continuing education, for 50 years, I think most of us can agree that we've been developing programs that are meeting industry needs for quite a long time. Could we maybe explore this idea a little bit deeper? What is then the motivating points here behind micro-credentialing? If it's not a new idea, why is there so much recognition, so much attention being placed on this?
I'll jump in with two thoughts. The first one is that what's changed here, what is different, is not really the way that we deliver programming. Often right now what's happening, especially with the term micro-credential that's being used a lot across the country, is that provinces or governments are putting a value next to what a micro-credential should be. So we then run around and develop the training around whatever parameters they've given us. That's not that different from what we've always done. We've always tried to create certificates of completion or certificates of attendance or any number of certificates that are not the traditional diploma, degree, etc. We've always tried to develop them based on some kind of a parameter. And it's always going to be tied to, hopefully, skills and industry needs. What's different, though, is the digital element here. And the digital element is what makes the end result more valuable than previously. And so that's exactly what Julie was just talking about the end result means that I now have something that empowers me as a learner, as a graduate. And that also provides more information for industry than ever before. And I think it is a tool that I believe we can use to really highlight in a much better way what the learner is doing. So I'll share with you in a minute a couple of documents that you might be interested in looking at. A colleague of mine, Thomas Gauthier from Florida, wrote a paper, which I'll include for you. I'll include the link, and just a recent paper that he released in 2020. And he looked at the value of a micro-credential from the perspective of industry, not from the academic perspective, but from the employer. And what he found was that competency-based hiring is beginning to really catch on as employers really insist on having very specific understanding of an applicant's abilities before they extend an offer. And the alternative digital credential is really what offers prospective employees a mechanism to articulate their competency, and they offer employers a profound way to certify an applicant's abilities. That was never there before. So this is, again, back to that digital element. Now, his central research question in his paper is, do employers see value in post-secondary micro-credentialing? And the answer is basically yes, they do, because of all the things that we just finished talking about, the way that one can see into the capability of an individual through the digital credential, through the metadata that's provided. So, I think that there's definitely an opportunity here for students to build their employability knowledge base, that they really should be earning alternative digital credentials along the way of their traditional learning. And I'll speak to that a little bit more before we finish today, because I think that's where we can have a real change in the way that we deliver our programs. But I'll let Julia jump in right now. It's
interesting that you cite the Florida article. That's exactly where this entire kind of suspicion around the validity or value of the traditional undergraduate four-year degree as a proxy for employment readiness has come from is from the States. Primarily, I mean, it's certainly been taken up in Canada. Our previous government in British Columbia referred explicitly to graduates as taxpayers, so that the universities were graduating taxpayers. So what we're challenged by, and there's a comment from Candace in the chat that speaks to this as well, which is what we're challenged by is that the undergraduate degree as proxy for employment readiness no longer serves from an industry perspective. I would argue that it serves very well, and that we have much to continue to admire about what an undergraduate degree does in terms of preparing people for job readiness. But what you're arguing, Dan, around picking up specific skills and competencies in a kind of a co-curricular way, I think is a really important feature because the workplace has changed, and because expectations of what a starting out employee brings to the workplace are in fact different. And the other thing I think is, and I'm going to disagree a little bit about the value being specifically in the digital, because I think the digital comes by virtue of the fact that we live in a digital world. And so the digital is a function of our progress regardless, and how digital our transcripts are really depends on how quickly the institutions are able to move. And we all know that that's at the speed of molasses. So the problem is not so much that we don't have digital credentials or the opportunity to use them, it's that institutions are not adopting them rapidly enough, and that the traditional transcript, as we've heard, does not document the skills in the way that we need, which is why we end up with co-curricular transcripts, for instance, which is why we're talking about badging micro-credentials. And so what we really need is a revolution in transcripting that would take all of these things, everything that you learn in undergraduate, including all of your experiential education. And everybody remembers when we went through all of our course curricula to identify where students were exploring something experientially. So again, it's just this task of bringing things to the surface and documenting them in a way that makes it easy for employers to assess, because employers don't speak the language of post-secondary education. We need to take post-secondary education and speak the language of the employers in the market.
Sorry, if I could just jump in with, and I guess answer a question there from Danielle, or comment, because this is an idea that I think is worth exploring. So the documents that I put up there will give you some background to what I'm about to say here, but a lot of the research right now also points to the fact that employers or industry and academic institutions are not speaking the same language. And perhaps, in our best efforts to develop programs, perhaps we're not always creating programs that are specific to the exact skills, including soft skills, I might add, that employers are looking for. So there needs to be a better alignment between industry and between academic institutions. Certainly, they need to do a better job. The colleges and universities need to do a better job of communicating the skills and the competencies coming out of a specific program, and ensure that they're perfectly aligned back with those needs. And that may mean more program-based learning, more internships, more workplace integrated learning, that type of stuff that gets us closer and closer to that industry. But students need to do a better job of communicating their skills and their competencies as well. And that's something that they struggle with. Most graduates struggle with that. So the reality is, again, going back to the work from my colleague, was that he found that what industry was telling him was that the reality is that competencies, or competency, is the new currency for being hired, and that you really need to demonstrate that. So to go back to Danielle's question there, or comment, yeah, I do think that there is a model that perhaps we haven't looked at too much. I mean, we often think about alternative digital credentials or micro-credentials on their own, or as stackable models. Another model is to actually embed them within an actual traditional program. And the reason we do that, why we want to do that, is because we would want to highlight the skills and competencies within an actual diploma program or a degree program or whatever you want. The student is still going to pursue and get the credit for a course. But as we all know, that credit shows up on a transcript that doesn't tell you anything. And unless an employer is able to go through a course syllabus, you're never going to know really what that individual was involved with. So by issuing badges, digital badges, along the way for very key competencies within individual courses, we now highlight what the individual is really learning. And that is much more valuable information for the learner, for the graduate, than the accumulation of 10 courses that they completed with X grade, in X time frame. The ability to then share that information sets them up for much more success and allows them to market themselves much more efficiently.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And Danielle's just said like a history degree could include a badge for written communication, which yes, I think that could be the exact kind of thing. I will throw out the caution that I have learned over my long career, which is that if you want to have these conversations at Senate, you need to be very, very politically savvy. So those of you who were with us last week saw my comment in the chat where when I did a presentation on micro-credentials at our Senate, one of the faculty members present referred to them as something that was evil, which is perhaps a little bit hyperbolic, but we do see on the faculty side, and not only at my current institution, but I would argue at all of the institutions I've worked at variously, there is huge suspicion around the notion of identifying competencies and documenting their acquisition in any way at all, that this is somehow reductive and that this is going to water down or otherwise reduce the value of the traditional bachelor's degree or graduate programming, but really specifically the bachelor's degree. So you need to be very savvy when talking about this kind of credentialing, because I've discovered that when I say, for instance, to my colleagues in science, that we might look at credentialing some of the lab skills that students acquire so that they would be able to then show that sort of to an employer, or that we might be able to do parallel programming that would give students particular kinds of lab skills that we know increase employability. The reaction can be very defensive. We do that. This is already happening in our programming. Why do you think you would need to do this as something that's additional? And so that goes back to Dan's point, where we also have to be able to figure out how to empower students, assuming that my colleagues are speaking the truth. We have to empower students to be able to display those competencies. So there's this tension between what's being delivered and what's being conveyed. And this, I think, goes back to why this conversation keeps coming back to credentialing. It's about credentialing learning that may be happening within undergraduate degrees or may be happening somewhere else, but in either case needs to be documented in a way that's portable, accessible, and that belongs to the learner, which I think maybe takes us to democratization.
Thanks.
I wanted to share one thought on that because you triggered something that I had just read recently, and that's the fact that skills taught by academics versus the skills sought in the workplace. They're not always the same thing. And I think as institutions, academic institutions, we need to do a better job to ensure that what we're teaching, the skills that we're teaching, are actually the skills that are being sought and immediately. And that might mean that programs have to undergo changes much more rapidly than a 5-year period. But that is essentially what I think micro-credentials give us the ability to do, because they're much shorter anyway. So they really need to be evaluated, much more often.
Thanks, Dan. So this leads me then to the last point, which is kind of a two-parter. And the first part of this is really to look at, in order to get to where we need to be, based on what Julia was just talking about, we have a couple of challenges, and the challenges are this. We don't have frameworks to speak of. We don't have a qualifications framework for the kinds of credentials that we're talking about. We don't necessarily have a very clear skills network or framework to identify specific skills that we can actually define and standardize. We also don't have a credentialing framework that speaks on non-degree. So are we chasing the wrong thing by trying to develop these frameworks, or are these frameworks really the catalyst for where we need to go next?
That, we've been operating in my world, continuing education and corporate training, where I've spent the better part of the last 15 years. We've been operating, with very little in terms of framework. The framework that exists in Ontario speaks to very specific certificates of around 250 hours and up, and go all the way up to a PhD, and often are much more clearly laid out at the college level in Ontario. The university continuing education is really wide open, and it's up for interpretation. And so that hasn't stopped us, though, without that framework, from moving forward and meeting the needs of students and the public. So I think it would be great to have a framework, but I really feel that with everything that I'm hearing across the country, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to arrive at something like that. I think we may have missed the boat on this already. Have the horses been let out of the barn already, and it's too late to bring them back in? Not necessarily. I mean, it would take a lot of work to bring together everyone and to arrive at a national framework. But I think without that framework, there's still enough concepts out there that if we stick to credentials, micro-credentials that are relevant, right, that speak to very specific needs in the labor market, that are verifiable because of all the technology that's in place, that are safe, guarded, and that are owned. The data itself is the property of the earner. Those are very key fundamental principles, which would be a part of any framework anyway, and what few frameworks are out there. I know in Ontario, eCampus Ontario has done a great job of starting the process and getting people thinking about it. I think we're on the right track with that, but sure, we could do better.
Yeah, I agree that the lack of a framework shouldn't be that enormous of an obstacle. The point of this whole conversation is that we want to make learning explicit. We want to make the competencies explicit, and so the framework is almost secondary to that, as long as what the learners are able to communicate is clear. We know from 4-credit studies that in British Columbia, we have an amazing transfer system where students are able to port their credit from one institution to another pretty much seamlessly, and have been able to do so for, again, nearly 50 years. When we were having the conversation around micro-credential recognition and creating a framework in BC, one of the goals is to make micro-credentials transferable. And I could see my colleague at the BC Council on Admissions and Transfer, his face just fell at the thought of trying to build an articulation framework for non-credit programming, kind of after the fact, right? Layering an articulation system over top an already existing framework of programs. We have a myriad of programs available across the country, and trying to standardize those retrospectively or retroactively, I think it might be a mug's game. We could certainly provide broad strokes guidelines, which I think is what's been happening in terms of how micro-credentials are being defined. But getting something beyond perhaps knock codes with some levels attached to them, I just think it's probably unachievable.
Wrap up with one controversial idea then. Let's suppose that we had a magic wand, and tomorrow we can wave that wand and say every credential in the country is going to be articulated in terms of the specific learning outcomes. Magic wand, right? If that could happen, what's the point of a micro-credential then? Wouldn't everything we do within at least continuing education be considered a micro-credential? So if we were to recognize in an authentic manner those learning outcomes, then is there anything else of value in this micro-credential space?
Said that in many ways right now, everybody's running around, institutions were running around to meet the requirements set out by provinces. And why is that? Because there's probably money behind it. And so where there's money, people, the institutions will run after that money. And if they tell us it has to be 12-hour or 12 weeks in length, we will make it 12 weeks in length. I think that certainly if what you're saying, what you're proposing there, Rod, would happen or could happen, then yeah, again, micro-credentials is the term that we're using today. It's out on the radar. But if you took that right out of the lexicon of our education language, I think we would still continue to develop programs that are whatever length are required to meet the needs of industry. And today they're being called micro-credentials because that's the hot word. Will that stick? Possibly. I'm not that concerned about the name, to be honest with you. And that's why I like the term, the alternative digital credential, because I think that focuses more on, again, the digital element. And then the length is not necessarily micro all the time. It doesn't have to be micro because a digital credential can be attached to, a diploma or a degree for that matter, to, again, provide all the information, the metadata that's currently not available for an individual.
I don't know, Rod, that would, I don't know if it would change anything, your magic wand. It's what we're already doing.
Mm-hmm.
I bore my colleagues with this because I don't think that micro-credentials are anything new. I agree with Dan. I think it's the documentation that's different. And that's what we need to be focusing on, and not worry so much about that everybody's doing the same thing in the same way. If we've got market driven validated programming where the outcomes and the competencies and skills acquired are made explicit in some way, it's the making explicit in some way that is going to distinguish the micro credential from everything else that we've been doing all the way along. It's making the implicit explicit.
Right, and I guess that's the big question. If everything becomes explicit, including degree programs, then really maybe there is value, as Dan was saying earlier, in those learning outcomes that are being attained within a degree program. I mean, the perception right now that degrees are non-functional is primarily based on the fact that many employers don't know how to interpret a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. But let's suppose that they could. Let's suppose that those learning outcomes could be achievable and interpretable. That's, in my view, that's a game changer. And then in my view, then if we all do that, not just CE, but if we all authentically articulate those learning outcomes, then this exercise becomes focused on that endpoint. That the digital recognition, right, is important.
Yeah, I think what would happen then is that industry would be much more able to interpret what we're doing. Right now, a lot of it lies behind, a brick wall of academia, and they're not quite sure what we're churning out, other than the name of a program, perhaps a statement on our website that says what we're attempting to do. But if we could be much more clear, they would understand exactly what it is we're doing, and may be able to tell us, hey, you're off base here. This needs to be slightly different, and we might be able then to rely, on that relationship to be much better and have our programs be much more current. And then again, the student would be much more empowered, which would then set them up for a much different recruitment experience. I've had some HR practitioners tell me that they welcome this system because they actually see it doing away at some point with a resume. Why do you need a resume if you can clearly translate your capabilities to me in a verifiable way? The
faculty member that I was speaking with goes to when he starts saying that micro-credentials are evil. So the concern around making the implicit explicit at the undergraduate level with bachelor degrees is quite different than what we're talking about with micro-credentials. But your average faculty member, and I speak as someone who was a faculty member for nearly 30 years, isn't terribly concerned with making the implicit explicit. That's not how they operate. That's not what they're, and I think that's changing. I think as we're seeing faculty demographics and the average age start to go down among our faculty, that we're seeing a change in that. But this sort of old school approach that your bachelor's degree is in of itself, that document that demonstrates job readiness, as that value of that degree decreases in the way that we previously understood it, then the value of these explicit articulations of skills and competencies rises. So Bill asked a question about, does that sort of turn universities into colleges? And I would argue no, because universities in undergraduate and graduate programming are actually doing something quite different, I think, for the most part, than what we're doing with with micro-credentials, whether it's in continuing education or elsewhere. So I think that, the market's, it's a big market, and people go to school for really different reasons. And one of the reasons I think, and I want to address Tanis's questions because she's been asking about PLAR. I think one of the reasons people do micro-credentials is as a proxy for PLAR, so that someone who's been employed for many years will go and do a certificate in something that they're already really good at. And we see this with our learners all the time. They do something that they're already really good at in order to get a credential that they otherwise don't have. Does it make PLAR easier? No, I don't think anything's ever going to make PLAR easier. PLAR is brutally hard, and it always will be. But what it allows is for people who are in the workplace already to accredit competencies that they may already have, or to increase the level of that competency from, say, competent to expert. And those are the kinds of things that make me really excited about micro-credentials.
Thanks, Julia. Being mindful of time, I'm going to turn it over to David to maybe see in the remaining moments that we have left if we can at least vet a couple of questions as we wrap this up.
Sure, thanks, Rod. This has been a really interesting conversation. Lots of fascinating comments and questions. I'm going to go to Russ's comment. He says, do general degrees like BAs and BScs, for example, really have intelligible workplace outcomes that will be meaningful to employers? And then he asks, should they? I think it's a question that's quite relevant given what we're talking about.
So I'm happy to jump in on that one, because I don't think they do explicitly, although I think that as the notion of explicitly stated learning outcomes at the course and program level, they do help with that. And someone was saying we don't do a very good job of teaching students how to speak about the competencies that they're acquiring. I think learning outcomes properly written and properly articulated and reinforced will help students to articulate, but do general degrees have intelligible workplace outcomes? No. Should they? Depends who you ask. If you ask the government will say, yeah, they should. And that's what's missing in post-secondary education, especially governments who say universities are graduating taxpayers, because they're not interested in your critical thinking skills. They're interested in your ability to do your taxes and stop at a stop sign. So, this is where the tension comes between what we start to ask big questions. What is a university? What is an undergraduate degree?
Exactly. What do you think, Dan? Sorry, Brad.
I would say that the area that those programs, those bachelor programs could perhaps tap into in terms of certain skills that are required in industry would be the soft skills, which again are lacking in many programs. There's a number of studies in the literature about how well we do as colleges, universities throughout the world, by the way. So this is not just a North American issue. We do really well in preparing students technically. For example, a number of studies of software engineering students and programs, how they come out knowing everything, but yet when they get into the real world, they don't know how to run a meeting, they don't know how to lead a team, they don't know how to do anything that's related to soft skills and leadership, and it's lacking. And so schools are having to go back and figure out how do we incorporate those skills back into the program by changing the way we teach. So yeah, a sociology degree, a psychology degree, whatever, yeah, those could be incorporated in there so that at the very least, those communication skills, teamwork, collaboration, those types of skills come through loud and clear.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So let's go back to one of the more provocative comments that Julia made, which was that we really need a revolution in how we do transcripts at universities. And, ideally the transcript should include everything that the student has learned in degree programs, in co-curricular activities, through micro-credentials. Everything should be a one-stop shop. I guess my question is, do you think is that within the realm of possibility? Is this something that could actually be done, perhaps further down the road, but is this actually possible?
Of course, what is it that hinders us as academic institutions? It always seems to be, in my experience, systems. Here you're talking about something that would have to take into account a number of different systems as a student goes through a different learning experience, and ideally it should follow that person through the life of the student. through their entire life, so that it shows, it demonstrates the accumulation of different skills and competencies. But I think we have to start with our own home base, and if everybody begins to develop similar systems, then we may be able to look at combining them into some format.
Yeah. Julie, what do you think it would take?
I mean, I think that I think we have the technology. I think it has to be the right technology. I think we're hearing some really interesting things, some developments that are happening, but there are also some limitations to what we're seeing out there as possibilities for learners to for institutions to provide ways for learners to capture their learning. I think there has to be the institutions have to be convinced that there's a reason to do this beyond us sort of saying it's the right thing to do. I think we need to hear from market, we need to hear from students, we need to hear from the community in ways that will persuade, registrars' offices, or maybe even presidents and VP finance offices. Maybe that's really where it is, because the registrars are already working on this, right? We've seen what's happening in Canada with the platforms that are available. So it's just about implementation and uptake.
Great.
I think
we're almost ready. Rod, do you want to go ahead, Rod?
Yeah, just maybe one last comment I was going to mention. Just, one thing I think we need to do is we need to be uber critical. And this is where we need a research lens, uber critical about those technologies that we are adopting, because I think sometimes we adopt technologies with perceptions that they're going to solve our problems. And then we have to then adopt to the technologies that we've adopted in order to then change our processes, which then becomes the tail wagging the dog. So we have to be very cognizant of the limitations and be autocritical. The other thing I will say too is that I think we need to be very careful when it comes to the degree end of the house. I think that many of the things that we are trying to articulate in terms of those learning outcomes, and I think Dan put it really well, I think those soft skills are essential. But I do fear that from a science standpoint, here's one example. Back in the 1960s, there was a lot of government intervention and concern with research that was focused on programming and initial ideas with things that were focused on machine learning and artificial intelligence, things that what we call today. They were seen to be kind of trivial, kind of on the side. And we've seen that usually in science, there's a 30 to 40 year gap before they reach a society and they have major impacts, and those technologies have had major impacts. I fear that if we don't have, if science programs cannot articulate real world skills at the moment, it will seem to devalue what science is doing when in fact these degree programs have a much longer perspective. That's not their design. And so that's where I think we need to be very careful that we're not, giving to government that if a science undergrad in biochemistry is not receiving skills that are relevant to today, who cares? Maybe what they are achieving are skills that will be that will change the marketplace and change what we do 10 years or 20 years from now.
Great. Well, thank you, Rod, and thank you, Julia and Dan, for a really engaging conversation. The chat function has been overflowing with some really interesting comments and questions. We've hit the top of the hour, so I think we'll close today's session here. I want to thank all three of you for a most engaging conversation on the recognition of alternative credentials. And on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for joining us today and hope that you've enjoyed today's webinar and any of the other webinars in this series that you may have been able to attend. As I mentioned at the outset, we do have information and recorded sessions on the Extended Education website that was provided a little while back in the chat function. So if you're interested, please follow the link and you'll see that in the chat. Thanks again, everyone. And thanks again to our presenters for a really good conversation. I hope everyone has a great weekend.